8th of May, 1945. At last, the darkness was lifted. The people celebrated across Europe and throughout the world. Victory over Nazi Germany. From the D-Day landings on the beaches of Normandy in June 1944, it took almost a full year to win the war. Facing defeat, Adolf Hitler became ever more relentlessly determined to fight to the very finish. As his Third Reich slowly collapsed about him, the brutality of the warfare, the fanaticism of the Nazis only increased. Those 11 months, the most relentless and brutal period of the Second World War, left an eternal scar on hearts and on history. In the summer of 1944, the Normandy landings were a success. At the same time, on the Eastern Front, Stalin unleashed his vast army. The Allies thought that the war would be won by Christmas. In December, to the Allies' surprise, Hitler launched a massive counterattack. It failed, but Hitler wouldn't surrender at any cost. The last 5 months would be the most brutal of the war. In the new year of 1945, Hitler launched Operation North Wind. He used every plane at his disposal in an attempt to annihilate the Allied Air Force that had defeated him in the Ardennes. But the Allies won this battle. The Germans were unsettled to learn of this fresh defeat. But Hitler, with his exultant style, convinced them to dig in.
Ich erwarte von jedem Deutschen, dass deshalb seine Pflicht bis zum Äußersten erfüllt, dass jedes Opfer, das von ihm gefordert wird und werden muss, auf sich nimmt. Ich erwarte von den Bewohnern der Städte, dass sie die Waffen schmieden für diesen Kampf, und ich erwarte vom Bauern, dass unter höchstmöglicher eigener Einschränkung das Brot gibt für die Soldaten und Arbeiter dieses Kampfes. Ich erwarte von allen Frauen und Mädchen, dass sie diesen Kampf so wie bisher mit äußerem Fanatismus unterstützen.
One German woman wrote, "For the last months of the war, I had to fight back my tears each time I heard Hitler's voice on the radio. We didn't want to recognize the signs, which were ever clearer, announcing the impending downfall. In our hearts, we were afraid of the terrible truth." Meanwhile, to the east, the Red Army took back the initiative. Fresh supplies had reached the troops massed along the Vistula. But this concentration had not gone unnoticed. In Germany, General Guderian sounded the alarm. He implored Hitler to regroup his troops on the Eastern Front to counter a Soviet attack. But Hitler would have none of it, scoffing at the supposed threat. It's the biggest bluff since Genghis Khan, who came up with this idiocy. Even Himmler refused to admit it. "You see, General, I don't think the Russians are going to attack." General Guderian tried desperately to convince his superiors. Hitler repeated, "This intelligence is completely idiotic. Whoever wrote it should be shut up in a lunatic asylum." Deaf to all advice, Hitler gradually shut himself into his own world. As Guderian had predicted, in mid-January 1945, first Konev, then Zhukov sent their armies across the Vistula. Endless columns of T-34 tanks advanced along a front of more than 900 kilometers, stretching from the shores of the Baltic to the heart of Poland. It was a devastating attack. The Russian steamroller was back in motion. The gunfire was so loud that even Zhukov had to cover his ears. For Stalin, this offensive was of capital importance. In a few weeks, he was due to meet Churchill and Roosevelt in Yalta. He didn't want Poland to slip out of his hands. On the 17th of January 1945, 5 months after the start of the insurrection, the Red Army entered the Polish capital. They found a ghost town. There was no one left to contest the authority of the new occupying force. The Polish communists had no trouble taking over the reins. The Soviets paraded in the capital to celebrate a victory that came a little too late. Having liberated Warsaw on the 27th of January 1945, the Soviets discovered the Reich's biggest secret. A camp the size of a town surrounded by barbed wire. Auschwitz-Birkenau. The camp had been evacuated by the SS just 10 days beforehand. All the guards had fled. The Soviets found 7,000 deportees abandoned there. 7,000 survivors from more than 1 million people murdered. Before they left, the Nazis had tried to erase evidence of their crimes. They blew up the gas chambers and the crematoriums. But these factories of death also formed the center of a system of plunder. The Soviets found hundreds of thousands of pieces of clothing, tens of thousands of shoes. In a shed, they discovered 7 tons of human hair. In January 1945, around 550 camps were still active across the Reich. Even in their downfall, the destruction of Europe's Jews remained a primary objective for the Nazis. For the Allies, the liberation of these killing grounds was not a priority, especially since the accounts given by journalists were so staggering that many people in the West refused to believe them. When the British reporter Alexander Worth entered the Majdanek camp in July '44, he immediately wrote an article on how these death machines worked. The sorting, the gas chambers, the crematoriums, the bones ground as fertilizer for the adjacent cabbage fields. But the BBC and the New York Herald Tribune doubted the veracity of his report. Many towns liberated by the Red Army hid mass graves. To the Nazis, the Jews, the Poles, were nothing more than slaves or fertilizer. In 15 days, Zhukov and his men had covered 350 kilometers. No one in the Nazi leadership had anticipated such a rapid advance. General Guderian wrote, "The Russian tidal wave is taking on utterly disastrous proportions for us." And yet the Germans continued to fight, mainly because they were afraid. The Red Army had shown some particularly barbaric behavior. Neighborhoods and villages were sometimes torched. Stalin's army plundered shamelessly in this land of plenty. Radios, saucepans, watches. One Soviet soldier wrote, "The Germans abandon everything, and our men have invaded the houses. Everything is in flames. Down from pillows and feathers from mattresses are flying everywhere. Everyone from the foot soldier to the colonel is carrying away his plunder. This town has been crucified. The Germans are right to flee from us, like the plague. Anyone suspected of being a Nazi could be shot. Almost 100,000 Germans were summarily executed. One Soviet soldier noted, "The German mother should curse the day she gave birth to a son. Let them experience what they wanted to inflict on others." In eastern Prussia, the Soviets briefly occupied the town of Nemmersdorf. The inhabitants were massacred. An orgy of violence was unleashed. Several women were said to have been crucified naked on barn doors. The Red Army realized the scale of the atrocities committed by the Nazis. Millions of prisoners of war starved to death, and millions of civilians murdered. The Russians discovered the camps at Majdanek, Auschwitz and Treblinka. Having lost 20 million of their own, the Soviets were burning with vengeance. The propagandist, Ilya Ehrenberg, had for months been urging in the Red Star newspaper, "If you haven't killed a German each day, your day has been wasted. Kill the Germans. That's what your old mother asks of you. The children are imploring, kill the Germans. That's what your homeland demands of you." The divisions and armies are not advancing alone on Berlin. With them, there are the trenches, the mass graves, the ravines filled with the bodies of the innocent, the cabbage fields of Majdanek, and the trees of Vitebsk, where the Germans hanged so many unfortunates. The boots, the little shoes and slippers of the little children murdered at Majdanek walk alongside them to Berlin. The Red Army became experts in nurturing hatred, and in its path, the enemy's womenfolk were particularly targeted. Rape became a weapon of war. One young Soviet officer recalled, "Women, mothers and their children were lying on both sides of the road, and before each of them was a noisy gaggle of men, their pants down. And our men shot those women who tried to save their children. Smiling officers stood by, making sure each soldier, with no exceptions, took part." Stalin in person excused these crimes. He declared, "Imagine a man who fought from Stalingrad to Belgrade, who has seen his homeland devastated over thousands of kilometers. How can such a man react normally? What is so awful in his having fun with a woman after such horrors?" Across the whole German territory, close to 2 million women are thought to have been raped. After hesitating for a time, the Nazi regime publicized these atrocities.
Und wie haben sich die Soldaten und Offiziere nun in ihrem Ort den Frauen gegenüber verhalten?
Man kann hier gar nicht von Soldaten und Offizieren in diesem Sinne sprechen. Man kann hier nur sprechen von bestialischen Horden. Denn die haben sich alle gleichmäßig benommen, alle täglich betrunken. Sie haben also alle Frauen vergewaltigt, von Jugendlichen angefangen von 13 Jahren bis zu Frauen von 68 Jahren. Es ist in meiner Gegenwart eine 68-jährige Frau vergewaltigt worden in allergemeinster Weise.
Und diese Volksgenossinnen hier auch, ja?
Ja, sogar meine Mutter von 60 Jahren haben sie nicht geschont, sondern haben sie auch bestialisch vergewaltigt.
The advance of the Soviet troops spread panic among the civilians. Hundreds of thousands of Germans took to the road in the midst of a particularly harsh winter. To escape, thousands of terrified men and women swamped the stations and ports. In January 45, nearly 8,000 Germans packed onto the Wilhelm Gustloff. It was sunk by a Soviet submarine. More than 5,000 people disappeared beneath the waves, 3 times more than were lost on the Titanic. By February 1945, 4 million Germans, 8.5 million according to some estimates, were displaced. 50,000 people were arriving in Berlin every day. While refugees clogged the roads of Germany, the Soviet troops who started out from the Vistula stopped about 80 kilometers from Berlin on the banks of the Oder. Zhukov's offensive had been a success. In total, the Germans had 350,000 casualties. Having conquered most of Poland and imposed his domination on the Balkans, Stalin went to the Yalta Conference in a position of strength. Neither President Roosevelt, who was weakened by sickness, nor the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, whose country was drained after 5 years at war, stood up to him. The Big Three agreed to divide Germany into 4 occupied zones. To the west, there was one last hurdle to cross, the last natural barrier in Germany, the Rhine. All the bridges had been dynamited by the Germans. Field Marshal Montgomery was still hoping to be first to cross the river. But the Americans beat him to it. An advance unit of the 1st US Army found a bridge still standing at Remagen, near Bonn. The Germans had rigged it with explosives, but had not yet detonated them. The Americans immediately established a bridgehead on the eastern bank of the river. Hitler was furious and ordered the engineers whose charges had not exploded to be shot. Meanwhile, Patton had sent his troops across farther south at Oppenheim without notifying his superiors. He was already spreading panic in German territory. Monty had dreamed of being first into Germany. In fact, he was last, but it was he who led the biggest offensive. He was in command of 1.25 million soldiers. This time, the lessons of Arnhem had been learned. The drop zones for the parachutists were spot on. British troops pushed deep into Germany and increasingly were capturing very young soldiers. Farther south, the French forces under General de Lattre also advanced. They fought on German soil alongside the Americans. For the Allies, there was now a gaping breach. They could finally invade the Reich. This was good news for them, but not for Stalin. As soon as he learned this, he ordered Zhukov to take Berlin as soon as possible to avoid the Americans beating him to it. Once the Rhine had been crossed, German resistance foundered. Hitler had chosen to concentrate his forces to the east. He had exhausted his already diminished reserves in the costly Battle of the Ardennes. Now, some towns, rather than fighting to the bitter end, were flying the white flag. The Allies were making up ground. Churchill continually spurred on the Americans. "We have to push on and shake the Russians' hands as far to the east as possible," he urged. But Berlin was in the future Soviet occupation zone, defined at Yalta. Even if the Americans did take the city, they would have to withdraw later. They would not accept the 100,000 dead this might have cost, simply as a matter of prestige. Such humanitarian issues never hindered Stalin. So Eisenhower decided not to launch an assault in Berlin. His troops could even afford a break for some home-style R&R.
You'll see in the hollow esquire what the well-dressed man with his eye when he's shutting down the street with his pretty pie.
Marlene Dietrich paid them a little visit.
Hello, boys. I want to say that sharing this entertainment with you today is to me more important than doing the entertaining. I'm certain that we can look forward to a speedy victory. Goodbye. Good luck. Godspeed.
But Eich's armies did not down their weapons for long. To defeat Nazi Germany swiftly without too heavy losses in their ranks, the Americans and British pursued a merciless bombing campaign. They relentlessly pounded German industrial areas and annihilated cities packed with civilians. Their aim was to smash the Reich's economic potential and to break the morale of the population, thereby undermining the regime. Between January and April 1945, 471,000 tons of bombs were dropped on Germany. Cologne, Hamburg, and Berlin were all hit.
Well, men, now that we've been the first ones to Berlin, how would you like to go back again?
In mid-February, Churchill wanted to bombard the city of Dresden as a show of strength to the Soviets. The city was consumed in a firestorm. In under 24 hours, more than 25,000 inhabitants perished. A whole city with no war-related industry and of no strategic importance was destroyed. But destroying Dresden meant driving up the number of refugees and disrupted the movements of the Wehrmacht. The Allied leaders may have felt some regret over Dresden, but not for long, because Hitler's obstinacy drove them to maintain the bombing campaign, whatever the cost for the civilian population. At the end of March 1945, the Reich slipped into chaos. The outcome of the war was no longer in any doubt. A German officer noted in his diary, "We are reaching the end. Do our leaders have any exit strategy in mind? The death of our soldiers, the destruction of our towns and villages. Is there any sense to this now?" Another wrote, "Is there no one there to overpower the madmen and call for an end to this? Are they still generals? No, they are ordure, wet rags. They are cowards." But these words of revolt remained confined to private diaries. After writing these lines, those young soldiers returned to the combat. German society could not manage to rise up, and as a result, it continued its plunge to new depths. At Hitler's bidding, the regime launched a new phase, radicalization against the Germans themselves. Whoever was not prepared to fight would face execution. In Königsberg, 80 deserters were executed. Often, victims' bodies were left at the road sign with a sign, "I am a deserter and I refuse to protect German women and children." Villages displaying the white flag were threatened with destruction. But this radicalization was even more harsh on deportees. The progression of the Allied armies to the west and the Soviets to the east led Himmler to close the camps, sending the deportees on abominable death marches. The detainees were on the road, but not to get anywhere. The Nazis no longer had time to gas people, so they killed through cold and hunger. Those who could not keep up the pace of the march got a bullet in the head. When the Allies liberated the camps, they found most of them almost entirely empty. The Germans had only left certain deportees considered too weak to be evacuated. In April 1945, the Americans entered the Ohrdruf concentration camp, an offshoot of Buchenwald. Eisenhower was overwhelmed. "I never had such a shock in my entire life," he confessed. Patton was physically sick near a shed. Eisenhower ordered the population of the next-door town to visit the camp. In front of a crematorium oven where they burned 200 bodies a day, women fainted. Nonetheless, the officers insisted that the Germans confront the horrors which they had allowed to happen. On a table stood lampshades made of human skin. There were tattooed skins that a camp official had collected and shrunken heads. Trophies of Nazi barbarity. Discovering these horrors, one journalist wrote, "The gates of hell had opened." Other camps were liberated, and more visits were imposed on local populations. Eisenhower declared, "People tell us that the American soldier doesn't know why he's fighting. Now at least he knows against who he is fighting." The discovery of the hell of the concentration camps was a shock for the whole world. For 10 months, the Reich had been shrinking. In April, the final act began. Berlin, the last citadel, was preparing for the ultimate battle. On the 12th of April, 1945, the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra performed Wagner's Twilight of the Gods. To make up for the lack of personnel, an army of children, women, and the elderly, marshaled by several thousand SS fanatics, had to defend the capital. They set up obstacles. Goebbels did a good job, and all those defending the city had a smile in these propaganda images. To set ambushes, every German was equipped with a rifle or a Panzerfaust, an anti-tank weapon. The factories had churned out more than 3 million of them in recent months. In the streets of Berlin, people were given fast-track training. Many Germans still had faith in their Reich. One young soldier wrote to his parents, "I simply can't believe that the Führer would sacrifice us dumbly. No one can strip me of my faith in him. He is everything to me." certain officers confiscated white handkerchiefs to stop the defenders using them to surrender. Nazi dignitaries still believed, especially since in the United States on the 12th of April, the day of the concert, President Roosevelt died. Hitler rejoiced. The great miracle, the one I had always predicted, has happened. The war is not lost. Hitler was blinded by his own illusions. But the hope did not last long, because the Red Army was closing in on the capital. Around a model of Berlin, Soviet generals discussed the plan of attack. Supplies from the east had finally arrived on the banks of the Oder. Tanks, shells, planes, 42,000 guns and heavy mortars. On the 16th of April, the biggest artillery barrage of the war commenced. One 1,236,000 shells were fired. $100,000 tons of steel rained down on the Germans. Two million men moved on Berlin. The Soviet divisions attacked from every side. The Russians had one objective, the Chancellery, under which Hitler's bunker was located. Zhukov moved forward, suffering huge losses. Stalin wanted to see Berlin totally encircled to avoid the Anglo-Americans profiting from a sudden German collapse and entering the capital first. In Berlin, the ground itself shook. Each crossroads was defended, sometimes by young children. Hitler sheltered in his bunker. In these last pictures of the dictator, filmed 1 month earlier, the censor cut a piece of film which was never shown at the time. Incapable of controlling himself, suffering from what looks like Parkinson's disease, Hitler is no more than a shadow. Still, at no point was there any question of surrender. And yet, some 120 kilometers away, on the 25th of April in Torgau, the long-awaited day finally came. The Reich was cut in two. The Soviet and American armies met up. While for the leadership, this was a time to be wary, for the ordinary soldier, it was a time of celebration. That said, certain Soviet soldiers avoided excessive fraternization that might have sent them to the Gulag. In Berlin, 3 million people were caught in the trap. It was now a matter of survival. Here and there, a horse was cut up. However mighty the Soviet artillery power had been, even in a mechanized war, it is the infantry who have to finish the job. Street by street, cellar by cellar. In these last days, the motivation of the Germans changed. They were no longer fighting for their great Reich, for the Führer, or for National Socialism, but to save their skins. The Russians were closing in on the bunker, where Hitler was still positioning imaginary armies. The elites had fled the city. When Goebbels realized all was lost, he wondered, what's to be done with the people whose men don't even fight when their women are being raped? All the plans, all the ideas of National Socialism are too elevated, too noble for such a people. These folk deserve the fate they are about to meet. At the same time in Italy, on the 27th of April, Mussolini was captured while trying to escape. He was shot. His body and that of his mistress were brutalized by the crowd. When Hitler learned of the death of Il Duce, he concluded, "Dead or alive, I don't want to fall into the hands of the enemy. After my death, my body is to be burned and no one will be able to find it." On the 30th of April, deep in his bunker, Hitler committed suicide, along with his wife, Eva Braun. His body was then burned by his chauffeur, using about 200 liters of petrol. For 12 years, the dictator had ruled over Germany. He had dreamed of a 1,000-year Reich. This mirage disappeared in the ruins of his capital. One last lie. The radio claimed that Hitler had died leading the heroic defenders of Berlin. On the 30th of April, Zhukov's troops broke through. His soldiers seized the Reichstag. Vasily Grossman wrote, "I wanted to shout, to call to all our brother fighters who lay in Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian and Polish soil, who were sleeping the eternal slumber on the field of honor. Comrades, can you hear us? We made it." Two days later, the Russians reconstructed the scene. A photo was taken. But this historic picture had to be retouched because one detail had been overlooked. One of the soldiers was wearing several watches on his wrists. But where was Hitler? This question haunted the Russians. Soviet soldiers found a body which bore a strong resemblance. But it turned out they were photographing themselves next to a doppelganger. A team of specialists was sent by Stalin to investigate. They found the charred corpses of Goebbels and his wife, alongside with the lifeless bodies of their 6 children. A few months earlier, they were still being used for party propaganda. Their parents had murdered them before committing suicide. Hitler's remains were finally discovered in a bomb crater. When he learned of the Führer's demise, Stalin exclaimed, "That's the end of that bastard. A shame we didn't take him alive." The remains were secretly shipped to Russia. Even Zhukov, who savored his victory and paid a visit to the beast's lair, knew nothing of this epilogue. With Hitler dead, capitulation became possible for his successors. On the 7th of May, in a modest school in northeast France at the headquarters of Allied forces, the German representatives accepted the terms of an unconditional surrender. After the signing, General Jodl had the temerity to stand up and declare, "The German armed forces are now in the hands of the Allies. I hope that the victor will treat them with generosity." With the pens used for the signatures, Ike made the V for victory. But these images were not yet shown, because Stalin was not satisfied with this capitulation. The strongman of the Kremlin bemoaned, "It was the Soviet people who bore on their shoulders most of the weight of the war. Stalin demanded that a second surrender be signed the following day in Berlin. On the 8th of May, the American, French, German and British delegations crossed a shattered city. In Zhukov's headquarters on the edge of Berlin, they awaited the arrival of Field Marshal Keitel. When he entered, no one replied to his salute. The various delegations signed all 5 acts of surrender. General de Lattre signed for France. It was 11 p.m. on the 8th of May. But it was already 1 a.m. in Moscow. The Soviets noted the date as the 9th of May. But the surrender did not bring an end to the tragedy. The halt in hostilities was followed by a wave of suicides. Besides the high command like Himmler, many thousands of anonymous Germans killed themselves, sometimes with their families, for fear of the Soviets, or else to follow Hitler to the afterlife. Before the war, Hitler had promised the Germans, "Give me 10 years and you won't recognize Germany." He kept his word. It's over! It's over! That was the cry that could be heard in towns around the world as they celebrated victory. The people hailed the liberation they had waited so long for. But the joy was also tinged with gravity. The dark shadow of Nazism would not be erased in a day. The suffering endured had left an indelible scar on memories. Nazism had plumbed the depths of horror. The extermination of the Jews, the massacres of civilians, the torture of resistance members would forever haunt the conscience of humanity. Yet a continent had to get back on its feet. The ruined towns had to be rebuilt. The millions of displaced persons had to return home. These were the huge challenges of the post-war period. From this chaos caused by the Nazi order, a new era would nonetheless emerge.